Ethan came to the Thompson family at the age of 8, thinking his life would finally be wrapped in warmth and protection. But instead, he was denied something that should have been a given for any child. He longed to be seen as their son, truly, fully. But that moment never came. Or if it did, he never felt it. They never hit him, never raised their voices. But over the years, he cried every tear he had. And now, standing at their funeral, he can't cry anymore. He doesn't blame them. He's not angry. He didn't come here just out of gratitude. He came with a secret. Ethan never really liked the smell of lavender. Not because it was unpleasant. No, it was gentle, calming. But because it reminded him of a beginning that wasn't quite a beginning. The first time he saw Margaret Thompson, she was wearing a yellow dress that fluttered like light in the hallway of the orphanage. She smiled, warm, practiced, and crouched to meet his gaze. James stood beside her, polished shoes and patient eyes. They didn't make big promises, just offered a ride home, a room of his own, and spaghetti for dinner. At 8 years old, that was enough. The house had white walls, a dog with a name, and windows that didn't rattle when the wind howled. The first night, Margaret tucked him in with a kiss on the forehead. "In this family," she whispered, "you belong." Ethan believed her, for a while. There were pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, soccer games, bedtime stories about brave explorers who looked nothing like him but always saved the world. He tried to fit himself into those stories, tried to fold his edges inward, make himself smaller, quieter, easier to love. It was in the little things, the empty space next to his name on Christmas cards, the way neighbors looked too long when they came over with Peshue, or how Noah and Liam's friends asked if he was the cousin. He laughed when they joked, even when the jokes hurt. He laughed when Liam said, "Don't steal my stuff, man," after losing a pencil. Laughed again when Noah mimicked his voice, just enough to be funny, not enough to be cruel, at least not out loud. He never told Margaret, or maybe he did in his own way, lingering too long at the dinner table, asking to sleep with the door open, pretending to be okay with missing the ski trip, because the cabin was full. And when he turned 16, he finally said it. "I don't think I fit here." Margaret was drying dishes. She didn't look at him, just kept wiping the same plate over and over. "You have a roof over your head, food, a family." As if that should be enough, he didn't argue, just nodded and went back upstairs. Sat in the dark, listened to the silence and thought, maybe if he were more like them, he wouldn't feel so invisible in his own house. In the living room, a photo sat above the fireplace. Noah, Liam, the dos, all teeth in sunshine, arms slung over shoulders like anchors. Ethan wasn't in it. The chapel hadn't changed. Same oak pews, same high-arched windows that let in slices of muted light. Even the air smelled familiar, floral, polished, reverent, like it was trying too hard to be holy. Ethan stepped inside and the air shifted. Not loudly, just enough. Heads turned. Some immediately looked away, pretending they hadn't stared. Others didn't bother. Their eyes followed him like dust trails behind an old secret. He walked past them all, hands by his sides, footsteps soft against the wood. He didn't look for a seat. He didn't need one. He just stood, near the back, still silent, like a painting that didn't belong in the gallery. In the front row sat Noah and Liam, matching suits, polished shoes, grief-tailored for public display. Liam's jaw was tight. Noah's arm rested protectively on his wife's shoulder. Neither of them looked back, but their posture said enough. So he really came. A man in gray stepped up to the podium. The pastor, maybe, or just someone who had known their parents long enough to sound convincing. His voice floated out in practiced calm. James and Margaret were generous, their hearts wide open, their faith unshakable. Ethan listened, not to the words, but to the rhythm, the pauses designed for nods, the soft chuckles when someone mentioned Margaret's banana bread, James's stubborn lawn care routine. Then it was Noah's turn. He cleared his throat, adjusted the mic. "Our parents weren't perfect," he began, voice cracking at the edges, "but they loved with everything they had." Liam followed, wiping his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Mom used to say the best legacy is the people you raise. I hope we make her proud." There were soft sobs, sniffling. Someone in the back whispered, Amen. Ethan said nothing. He sat now near the last pew, hands folded, eyes open, heart tired. There were no tears. Not because he didn't feel, but because the ache had lived in him too long to spill over politely. To him, grief wasn't loud. It was quiet, like dust behind curtains, like a seat left empty year after year, like asking for love and getting silence in return. The eulogies went on. Stories painted James and Margaret as saints, generous, loving, inclusive, the kind of people towns build murals for, and maybe they were, just not for him. He watched Noah's hand tighten on the mic, Liam's face fold with emotion. He heard the crowd sniff, nod, smile sadly. They cry because they lost their parents, Ethan thought. I grieve because I never really had them. The room was still echoing with Liam's final words when Ethan rose. He didn't make a show of it. No dramatic pause, no clearing of the throat, just the sound of his shoes. Leather on wood, one step, then another, and then silence thickened like honey. No one moved. Some blinked, unsure if this was allowed. Others stared, as if waiting for someone to stop him. No one did. Ethan reached the podium and didn't touch the microphone. He didn't need amplification. The silence in the room did it for him. He scanned the room, faces stiff with unease, confusion, maybe even dread. He looked at Noah, at Liam. Their eyes didn't meet his. "Thank you," he said simply, voice low and steady, "for being here." He paused, not for effect, but for breath. "I won't speak long. I know I'm not who most of you expected to see here. Some of you didn't even know I existed. Some of you just forgot." He let that sit. No bitterness, no venom, just truth. "I came into the Thompson house when I was 8. I remember the first night. The porch light was on. The dog barked. Margaret handed me a blanket and said, 'You're safe now.' And for a moment, I believed her." A flicker crossed Margaret's sister's face. Recognition or guilt. "I got my own room, my own drawer, my name sewn on a Christmas stocking. But love isn't a stocking, and family isn't something you stitch once and hang over the fireplace." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I wasn't mistreated, not in the way people usually mean it. No one raised their voice, no one hit me. But there are other kinds of harm, like being told you're part of the family and then left out of every photo. Like watching your brothers pack for ski trips you're not invited to. Like hearing jokes that feel like paper cuts, small, but they add up." He turned slightly, not to accuse, but to release. "I once asked Margaret why I wasn't in the picture frame above the mantle. She said, 'Oh, honey, we just didn't have room in that one.' And I believed that too, for a while." The air in the chapel thickened. Noah shifted in his seat. Liam's hands tightened into fists, then relaxed. "I don't say this to shame anyone. That's not why I'm here. James and Margaret, they did what they thought was right. But sometimes love comes with conditions even the giver can't admit out loud. And sometimes silence hurts louder than words ever could." He looked down for a moment, not from shame, but to collect himself. "I love them, I still do. But not because they were perfect. Because even in the half-light, they tried. And maybe that's the saddest part, when people try, but not quite enough." Then finally his eyes lifted and found Noah's. Not with anger, just clarity. "I'm not here to rewrite anyone's story. I'm just here to finish mine." And with that, Ethan stepped back. No applause, no music, just the soft creak of the floor as he walked away from the mic and the sound of a room still holding its breath. Ethan didn't sit back down. He reached into his coat pocket, slowly, almost absent-mindedly, and pulled out a folded piece of cream-colored paper, worn at the edges like it had been opened and closed too many times. He held it up for a moment. This was in a small wooden box in Margaret's closet, tucked between old church programs in a dried corsage. A murmur rippled through the chapel. Ethan unfolded the letter, careful not to tear the crease, and began to read, his voice soft but unwavering. "My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say these words aloud. And maybe I never would have, even if time had allowed me. Cowardice has many faces. Mine was silence." He paused, not for drama, just to let the words breathe. I watched things happen in our home that I should have stopped. I saw the distance growing between you and your brothers. Heard the jokes, felt the shift, and still I said nothing. I told myself I was keeping peace, but peace that costs a child his belonging isn't peace at all. A woman in the front dabbed at her eyes. Someone coughed, too loud, like they were trying to break the moment. But Ethan read on. You never raised your voice. You never rebelled. And that made it so easy to overlook the weight you carried. You became invisible because we let you. And for that, Ethan, I am sorry. The last paragraph trembled slightly in his hand, but his voice held firm. The house on Willow Street is yours now, not because of guilt, but because it was always meant to be yours. You belonged in that home, even when we didn't know how to make space for you. Forgive me if you can. Mom. He folded the letter slowly, carefully, like it was made of glass. The chapel was silent. Noah's face had gone pale. Liam blinked hard, jaw locked, as if holding something back. Anger, disbelief, maybe shame. But Ethan didn't look at them. He just returned the letter to his pocket, then stepped down from the podium with the calm of someone who had said what he needed to say. Not for anyone else, but for the boy who'd once stood outside that house, wondering if he should knock or just keep walking. Ethan didn't say anything more. No grand closing line, no heavy sigh. He simply stood there for a moment, letter folded in his palm like a leaf. He wasn't sure whether to keep or let go. Then his eyes drifted, not to the crowd, not to the altar, but inward, to the boy he used to be, 8 years old, a suitcase too big for his arms, standing at the doorway of the Thompson house, wearing a hand-me-down jacket and shoes that squeaked with every step. The boy had been quiet, hopeful, unsure of the rules in a house filled with framed smiles. He had learned quickly how to be polite, how to disappear when needed, how to take up less space than he was given. And now, all these years later, Ethan looked at him and smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but a soft one. The kind you give someone when they've waited a long, long time to be seen. He turned from the podium. No one stopped him. No one clapped. Even the air didn't dare move. Ethan walked down the aisle, not slow, not hurried, just steady, as though a weight had been lifted not off his shoulders, but from somewhere much deeper. He returned to the same seat near the back, sat down, folded his hands, and breathed. Not the kind of breath you take to keep yourself composed, but the kind that comes after the truth has been spoken. After you've stopped asking for anything in return. For the first time that day, Ethan let the quiet surround him without pressing in. He didn't need to explain, didn't need to defend. He had said what needed saying, and that was enough. The final hymn faded, shoes shuffled against the chapel floor. Whispers returned, this time softer, almost uncertain, as people gathered, coats, touched arms, and made their way toward the doors. Noah and Liam left first, moving like men walking through fog. The rest followed, in twos and in threes, until the pews stood empty, the lilies still, the silence whole again. Only Ethan remained. He didn't stand right away, just sat there, watching the dust in the slanted sunlight. There was no rush, no wait, just stillness and breath. Then, quietly, finally, he rose. One last look at the urns, not to mourn, but to acknowledge, a small nod, a goodbye perhaps, or a beginning. He stepped outside. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Sunlight greeted his face, warm, golden, unafraid. He closed his eyes just for a second and let it touch him. Voiceover, calm, steady. Some people come to funerals to say goodbye. He came to reclaim his place in a story he never truly belonged to, until now. Fade to black, silence. Then a single line in white. Truth doesn't ask for permission. It just waits to be spoken.